Hi guys, it's Kamil here, and I'm coming to you with a video where I will try to address the question, is judging literature objective? I've seen Britta's video a few days back, and here's my piece that I'm throwing into the discussion to shake it up a bit. We'll see, right? Britta's link down in the box below. Writers, like any other artists, do not create the art in the bubble. They are like every one of us, at least in the aspect of being affected by social circumstances that they live in. Those social circumstances, be it their education, upbringing, current social issues, or current social and philosophical trends, as long as we are dealing with an aware person, are going to affect their work. A writer might want to create his own response to current social or philosophical or literary trend, giving them a twist in his own work. For example, Dostoevsky, that was a realist writer, created his subgenre of the movement. That later on was called sensational realism. He was more interested in the extremes of the reality than what was the norm. While his contemporary writers would often look at the subjects that he undertook as something too extreme to be a subject of the proper realist novel. Sensational realism, therefore, was Dostoevsky's response to the omnipresent literature trend back then, and through it he addressed the social ideas that were deeply discussed in Russia back then. In his novels, he argued with utilitarianism, socialism, nihilism, and offered his own recommendation to those questions how to live. His proposition was to devote oneself to God, obviously through Orthodox Christianity. He thought that Catholicism, for instance, was a Satan religion. There is a huge paragraph in the Idiot where he goes bananas with it. Okay, but let's go back to the topic. So a literature might be a piece of art through which an artist, a writer, creates his response to the world around him. There is also the other side to that issue. If the writer, that is observant, is interested in making money and knows that dragons, wizards and vampires are gold mines nowadays, he might create another fantasy novel with those elements in it. And this is not me throwing a shade on fantasy novels, as I believe that you can take any genre of literature and really turn it into a piece of art if your dragons, vampires or speaking cats are the tools to tell the bigger story. Not just another enjoyable, suspenseful political drama set in the fantasy world. If those are the tools, go for it. Ursula Le Guin was a science fiction writer that was able to stand out as one of the most remarkable writers of 20th century, using that genre to ask questions that our heads still puzzle upon. Same goes for Stanisław Lem, Polish science fiction writer. Talking about dragons and fairies, I mentioned the word enjoyable. And that brings us to the topic of enjoyment versus appreciation. Often when it comes to the question of literature or any other form of art, especially nowadays, we seem to put an equal sign between everything. And the statements, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or there's no accounting for tastes, are being used as if the enjoyment was the defining category and each man a valid critic. Do we really cannot judge the literature? And if we can, is everyone equally equipped to do it? If we can judge literature, are there any measurable elements we can take into account? In my opinion, we should not look for the mathematical equation, which obviously we won't be able to find. But for sure there are some objective factors for judging a novel. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned Dostoevsky and the fact that his work was placed in the certain spectrum, literary spectrum. Him responding to a literary trend realism. He did that by finding his own way of establishing his work among that trend, sensational realism. And through that form, he addressed the social issues he was the most passionate about. So we had the social philosophical element of the novel, those social issues, the art movement factor of the novel, realism, sensational realism, that obviously affects the form. Then we should ask about the craft of the artist. Here, the way he used the written word to present his art, a novel. What figures of speech are being used and how? From the most often used, like metaphors, to the ones used more rarely, like oxymorons. All of those elements, socio-philosophical elements, the form, the craft, are pretty objective. And of course, those are the elements that we can use to value the literature, at least the artistic side of it. And also, I wouldn't say those belonged only to the appreciation side in the conflict between enjoyment and appreciation, as when I see creatively crafted figure of speech, it makes me happy. Even more so when I see intelligently addressed social issues, that makes me even more happy, and obviously it affects my enjoyment from reading a book. Nonetheless, the element that is probably most closely associated with the enjoyment factor is the plot. And it's fair to state that plot is not most important aspect in the novel for me, but obviously it can only, if done well, and if all other elements I mentioned already are done well, it can only make me appreciate the novel more. Also, talking about the plot, I don't mean necessarily only the events or sequence of events around which the novel is constructed. By the plot, I mean the story that in the current moment or in a certain age a reader is speaks to one on the emotional level. Like Murakami does when you are in your 20s. I'm in the process, of reading Norwegian Wood, picking up the book, and I really think that he is able to create very sentimental atmosphere. The one a person cannot resist, really, being in his 20s. When you are young, slowly discovering that the world doesn't really fall down on its knees in the awe of your greatness, books of Murakami, where almost each and every one of his characters is a loner, that is indulging in the fact that he is super average, while in the same time the best chicks are sleeping with him, while the most remarkable guys want to be his friends. You know, it's very appealing and one cannot do anything but love it, especially when you are young and you feel, and I don't think you can feel any other way being 20, when you feel that you are hugely underappreciated by the world. Murakami does create a compelling atmosphere, and his lost under the radar characters being somehow appreciated by the best specimens in the surrounding as something that really speaks or spoke to me when I was 20 years old. And I think it speaks to everybody that age, unless you were Queen Bee in the high school, but then you probably don't read. But when I look at his novels from the more subjective angle, socio-philosophical spectrum, well, I mean, social life is difficult and often sucks. I agree. Feeling lonely, I can sympathize with that too. Not doing anything great aside from reading a lot and listening to the Beatles. I mean, which one of us wasn't there in our late teenage years? Reading this book that I loved so much, being in my 20s, I still enjoy the atmosphere. Those beautiful pictures of a girl head seen from the back, the shape of her ear, some often off but sometimes beautiful symbols. That is all great, but I cannot close my eyes to the fact that most of it lead nowhere. there's an uninteresting aspect to the main idea, be it a lost love for instance, and there's nothing particularly original he has to say about solitude, depression, anything really. And what's more, I cannot really close my eyes to the problematic topics, cartoonish characters, and the metaphors that are way overused. But this is the guy that said everything in life is a metaphor. I mean, yes, that's the way you see the world being young. But later on, you learn that people are neither as mysterious nor as interesting as you thought. That's called growing up. So, Murakami can be compelling, enjoyable, but can he be compared to Dostoevsky or to his contemporaries like Coetzee, Pynchon, McCarthy? I don't think it would be fair to put him in that category, as he would not be able to stand a chance. As long as we establish any objective elements, and as I said, I believe there are objective elements through which we can value literature. The second problem I mentioned, everybody seems to be a critic. Those common beliefs that have its roots in the proverbs, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or there's no account for taste, seem to be setting an equal sign between everything. And since we live in an era where everything that is not common or average is looked at as being elitist, those beliefs have a great ground to flourish. David Hume, in his essay on the standard of taste, named a few characteristics of an ideal critic. One should have a delicacy of taste. To translate it to the world of literature, the person having that quality should be able to notice all those figures of speech, like metaphors and others, social issues the writer is responding to, or art trends he is following. Of course, that comes or is enhanced by the second quality, the practice. One has to be well read, obviously, to be able to understand the piece of art that sits in one's hands. And I'm not saying I am, I just wanted to show a book. Sorry. The third quality, comparison, that is a complementary characteristic to the practice part, obviously. You know, if somebody tells me that he reads 5 books a year and then wants to lend me a perfect book, I cannot help but be skeptical and think, God, please don't let him give me another Paulo Coelho novel. Then, no prejudice. Your personal views should be as removed as possible. And I believe that is the hardest part. When I read Murakami for the first time, it was exactly the Norwegian Wood, and I thought it was great. Then I read Kafka on the Shore, then Wind Up Bird Chronicles, then I think I ended up with Koroles Tsukuru Tazaki, and went back here to Norwegian Wood, as it's part of my project of rereading books I loved being younger. Right now, knowing that most of his female characters are pixie dream girls, which I didn't know when I held this book for the first time. So now, when I know it, and when I read that the main character compares his new love interest to the wet, energetic animal, the voice in my head thinks, you chauvinistic pig. While in any other book, I would probably look at it as pretty innocent comparison. The last element Hume mentions is good sense, and good sense should manifest itself in knowing what the work of art is trying to do, but also understanding yourself well enough to know what are your characteristics that might affect your response to the work of art. So some of the characteristics of David Hume's perfect critic might sound a bit vague, but the elements that are still valid, in my opinion, is the delicacy of taste, practice, and comparison, and that's very important in judging a piece of art. Okay guys, tell me what you think about objectivity of art. Can one judge literature objectively? Also, if you are able to enjoy the book but still be critical towards it, thinking like when I read Murakami. I mean, this is pretty enjoyable, but this is not good if I compare it to any good literary work. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye bye, guys.